I'm involved in a series on the truth about things. And so I was asking Beth what would be a good subject to talk about. I was trying to think of all kinds of things. I thought about maybe daylight savings time or something that we haven't covered yet. We covered quite a few subjects in this little series. And she said, what about forgiveness? And I thought, I don't want to do that. I'm not very good at it. And that's exactly what I thought. I'm not an expert on forgiveness. So I asked somebody else what they wanted to hear, get another opinion. But I started thinking about this idea of forgiveness, and as usually happens, you open something or a book or something, and something jumps out at you, and that very thing happened, not in a book, but I've got a kind of a stack of papers next to my desk at home, and on top of it was the story of Joseph. And I got to thinking about that story, and I thought, well, that's a very good presentation of the idea of forgiveness. We don't necessarily think of it in that way. But it gave me something to think about in terms of forgiveness that makes a lot of sense. And so I'm going to share that with you. And you can see in our photo here that the woman is crossing a fence, and she's on the fence. And maybe that's the way a lot of us feel about forgiveness. We're not quite sure how to approach it. We know we're supposed to do it because we're told to. Do we know why? Do we know the principle involved? And so that's what we're going to look at today. And of course, the picture I like because we know she's going to go over. She's on her way over it. And so if we're on a fence about this whole idea of forgiveness, perhaps by the end of this talk, we'll also go over the fence, be on the other side. So we start with this idea. We're told we're supposed to forgive, and I don't know that we're told why. Well, if you forgive, you'll be forgiven. So there's kind of a clue there as to what the payoff is if we are forgiving people. But the bottom line here is forgiveness is freedom. The whole process of forgiveness, if we do it properly, is freedom. When we try to forgive and we don't feel freedom, we don't experience freedom, we probably have not done it. And we probably haven't done it because we're probably trying to do something that we can't do, something that's not within our ability at this moment, at least. Sometimes it is easier to let some time pass before we are able to forgive. But I have people all through my ministerial career. I can think of all kinds of situations I have been through that were never talked about when I was going through seminary. They kind of just sweep all that possibility under the carpet. But ministry can be a pretty brutal profession in a lot of ways. And it's hard. I don't know how anyone could prepare for it. But you just take it a step at a time. But there are incidents that I can recall, and I realize I still haven't let them go. Haven't let go of the people that were involved. And first of all, because I know I'm absolutely right and they're wrong. But what can I say? There's no way to resolve that. And I'm just being facetious or belligerent, I don't know which, but I know I'm not always right. But even when you're not right, it's difficult to let things go sometimes, unless you understand the purpose of doing it. You don't do it just to be a good Christian or a good person. You're trying to achieve freedom. And that's freedom to let go of that. If you think of every situation in your life where you're holding on to something or holding on to some relationship or person that didn't go so well, it's like holding on to a rope, and we're tied to that. And we understand that intellectually, but it's not always easy to actually free yourself from that situation where you can think of it and feel okay. And what I discover in myself is I can do that sometimes. Sometimes when I'm really feeling good, I can think back on some of the things I've been through and just say, well, that was interesting. let it go and, kick the dust off my sandals or my whatever I'm wearing and go on. And that's kind of a clue also, because when I'm feeling my best, I'm free. I'm closer to that experience of freedom. So it's easier to let go. It's easier to move forward because you're a bigger person at that moment. It's when we get down into ourselves that our world becomes pretty small, and it's the smaller our world becomes, the harder it is to forgive, the harder it is to let go. And forgiveness doesn't just involve, somebody else doing something to you. It could involve a decision that you made that you regret, or some situation that happened that was out of everybody's control. You had nothing to say or do about it, but there it is. You had to deal with it, and it left some mark on you. And those are difficult to deal with as well. All of these are. The human experience is, I think, that's the most difficult of all the things that we have to deal with, is other people. And I've never, made it a secret that I'm just as vulnerable with these kinds of things as you are and everybody else is. I don't stand up here so much as an example, although I like to think that I am sometimes, but I'm a student also. I'm one who's practicing this stuff, and I've got my list, and there's people that did some pretty nasty things throughout my life, to my church, to myself, to my family, and I don't understand why necessarily, but they have happened, and you're left with, what do you do with it? Do you hang on to it and suffer as a result, or do you let it go and move on? So sometimes we're better at it than others, but a lot of it depends on how we feel. The goal is freedom, but it is important to realize that nothing's blocking that freedom. It's not the hanging on to the person or the situation that is blocking your freedom as much as it is hanging on to the person you think you are that was offended, that was caught in the middle of whatever it was. And that's an interesting approach to take, is to realize it's not them, it's me seeing myself as a little person that can be harmed. That's the problem. And the freedom I seek is for me to be able to see myself for what I am, a spiritual being. To rise above whatever it is I'm going through. I said to somebody last week I would talk about the Las Vegas shooter, of all things. And I think things like this are important to look at, because we try to imagine families that are involved in some of the victims of that person that took it upon himself to just carry out this horrendous crime that he did. And how will they ever be able to forgive someone like that killed a loved one, just that was at at a concert? And so we try to put these things in perspective. How do we do that? And we look for people's motivation, and we can find the motivation, but it still doesn't make any sense. Nobody in their right mind would do something like that. People are still speculating about Hitler. Why did he do that? How could he have done that? And we can look at his childhood, we can go through all the things and try to reach some resolution as to why a human being would do this. I was reading in World War II, there was something like between 60 to 80 million deaths in World War II. And we focus on Hitler's 6 million Jews that he put to death. But a dictator like this, a person like this, and there were several at that time that were wreaking havoc on this planet. That's a lot of deaths. That's a lot of people. And so there's a lot of reason to be angry. Some families, what some people went through, it's just unspeakable. We can't even conceive of that. And I think of my little issues, and they're nothing compared to something like this. But so what if we find out why Adolf Hitler did what he did? He was sick. He was a sick man. And actually, we would have been way ahead if somebody would have figured that out before and taken him out, as opposed to letting him run rampant over everyone else and just generating this huge conflict. And I don't want to go down that road too far, but that's part of what we're looking at here. We're looking at it in a personal level, and we're looking at it really on a global level. There's a lot of reasons to look out at the world today and be angry and not be forgiving. So this applies in a lot of ways, and there's no answer to someone who would pick up firearms and start shooting into a crowd of people with the intention of creating as much havoc and harm as possible. It doesn't add up to us, to a normal, rational thinking person. And a lot of times the things that we are trying to get over, trying to forgive for, are connected to people just like that. If you want to read an interesting book, somebody in church many years ago gave me the book Sociopath Next Door. It's a very interesting study. What triggers people's thinking. Sometimes the rational thinker thinks one way, and nobody would, act beyond that. I mean, we have our standard of norms, I guess. But there are many people on this planet, and this book says one out of every four is sociopathic. And that means that they are totally self-centered, have no conscience, could care less if they hurt you or not, as long as they get what they want. And that's so we try to apply the good spiritual principles to certain personality disorders, and it just doesn't line up. It doesn't work like we think it will. And in a case like that, the best thing to do is just get away from them, get out of their life. Faster, the better. And that's a whole other subject too, and I'm not an expert in mental health, but I have certainly encountered my share of that type of mental disorder in churches. So it's people are always seeking positions of power, seeking to their goal in life is to take over, to win, to be on top of something. And that something to most people can be so small that we wouldn't even imagine them trying to do that, but they are. It's a very interesting thing to observe, and I never cease to be amazed by it. So the principle that I ran across, and I've of course taught this story many times over the years, it's the story of Joseph and his jealous brothers. The father was showing a lot of favoritism toward Joseph. And the brothers sold him into slavery. They schemed together and sold him into slavery. So Joseph goes through this huge ordeal, very painful, very demeaning, sold as a slave, and just the last thing in the world that he wanted to do. But through all of these various episodes in that movement that he went through, all those different cases that he went through, or different time periods that he went through in that slavery situation, he finally came out of that second only to Pharaoh. So he came out a winner. And his family was off another area. They had an extreme famine, and they came to Egypt to get help. And lo and behold, the brothers were there asking Joseph, who they did not recognize, for the help. And he recognized them. And what he said, I think, is very important for all of us, because it helps to, I think, heal a part of us that has a hard time letting go. And what he said to them is, you meant it for evil. In other words, he wasn't sugarcoating what they did or why they did it. he was basically saying, you guys are evil. You've got a problem. You did this not out of love or not out of anything other than the fact that you're just not much good. And I think we have a hard time saying that in situations that we're trying to overcome. But I think it's a very important thing to acknowledge. Because if you don't acknowledge it, that what they did is truly, their intention was to truly harm you. And that's not always true. But when it is true, there's a healing aspect to saying it, to accepting that that's true. They did try to harm me. It was intentional. Because what we try to do is take the high road and take all the responsibility, and if I'm upset by what they did, it's my problem. And that's true, because we're the ones hanging on. We're the ones that are not free. But what we want to do is experience freedom. So we call the spade the spade. You meant it for harm. You meant it for evil. But then he doesn't stop there. He says, God meant it for good. In other words, if the brothers hadn't done what they did, Joseph would never have been second in command to Pharaoh. Very powerful man. But he had to go through a lot of things. And the brothers did not do this intentionally. They were not trying to do him a favor. Joseph was very resourceful, and he went through all of these different things, doing the very best he knew how to get through them. And he came out on top. So there's like a movie running. There's the selling Joseph into slavery, then all the film that goes on in between, and that's usually, we're somewhere usually in that part of the whole process. But when he said, but all of this adds up to a greater good. Look what happened as a result of this. It's while that movie's playing, while we're in the middle of something, that is very difficult to imagine how greater good could come out of the thing that we're feeling hurt about, that we're suffering over. And so in that state, we're not grasping yet this truth that something better will come out of this. And we're there and we're trying to forgive without truly laying hold of that principle that the movie's still playing and it will come out with a happy ending. So we take a lot of responsibility ourselves. I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling resentful. That's my problem. It's something I'm doing to myself. Maybe they were just having a bad day. Maybe try to make all kinds of excuses for them. Sometimes it's easier just to say, well, they did mean it for evil. They were trying to harm me. It's not just me. I've had people in counseling talk about this, that they were trying to deal with someone that was actually pretty nasty. And they're trying to take the high road and be the good spiritual person. And sometimes it takes a person like myself to say, look at what they're doing. They were trying to harm you. They were trying to make you miserable. And just that acknowledgement, there's freedom in that. They don't feel so alone. They don't feel like this is something they've got to work out, because it's totally illogical in their minds. When somebody intentionally tries to harm you and you're trying to forgive them, you're trying to let them go, it's really hard to put all the pegs in the right holes, to line things up. So it helps sometimes, I find it helps with me to say, yes, they did mean it for evil. They meant to harm me. So what do I do about it? It's not trying to cover for them, and I think we often try to carry their cross. There are people that have grown up in had abusive childhoods and tried to somehow resolve that by taking the responsibility for that for the parents. The parents had abusive childhoods also, and they probably did. But every decision, every choice we make it's a conscious choice, and we're doing it for some reason. And if we're hurting somebody intentionally, then we need to get in touch with that. If somebody's hurting us intentionally, we need to get in touch with that as well. Not let them off the hook. Doesn't mean you run them down and beat them up or anything. Although you might, I don't know. Depends on the situation. No, I wouldn't encourage that, but you see what I'm saying is people can be responsible for harm in your life. And if you are trying to pretend like that's not true, or like you're bigger than that, and yet you're still suffering, you've got a problem. You've got something that's not resolved. You're not experiencing the freedom. So I think it is helpful to say, you meant it for evil. There's a closure with that. You did mess up. You did try to hurt me. I get it. And you don't have to say it to them necessarily. But that's not all. There's another part to that. Even though you tried to hurt me, the movie's still playing. There's a bigger thing involved here. Something greater, a greater good is unfolding through this, maybe as the result of the action that you took. Maybe because of what you did. Not that you were doing me any favors, but that set something in motion that caused me to see things in a totally different way and end up in a place I never would have imagined, in a better way. But if we don't let ourselves go there, if we don't say something better is unfolding through this, we will hang on to that moment and we'll stay there. And it's really hard to get past that. So when we think of someone like this Las Vegas shooter, we don't have to resolve anything in ourselves about that guy. He was sick. There's something wrong, something horribly wrong with him. Well, what about the idea that he's a child of God? Yeah. What about it? It wasn't a child of God pulling that trigger. It was a maniac. Somebody that was so out of touch with that divine spark in himself that he could do something like that. So we don't owe him anything, or people like him anything, spiritually. We owe ourselves a way to resolve that, a way to understand that, so we can move on. And I would never suggest to a parent of a child or whatever, some relation to anyone that was there that was a victim of that thing, to hurry up and get on with this, because sometimes these things take a while. And I've never had to deal with something like that. The things I have had to deal with have taken a while. So it's all relative, and but the principle's still the same. It's pretty inspiring when you hear the stories of heroism and people that were wounded and jump back up and say, this is not going to change my life. It's not going to get me down. These moments could be a turning point in every one of those lives, some way that we can't even imagine. It's often in moments of crisis that something is stirred in people, that it comes out. It's the worst in people that we see, and it's the best. But to hang on to the worst, to hang on to the worst view of something, it traps us. And that's where we are to let go. But don't be afraid to name it for what it is. Because if we can't, we probably won't let it go. We'll try to internalize it. It'll be like a smoldering ember burning inside of us. We'll put on a happy, forgiving face, and the whole world will say, boy, you are something. But you can't escape what's going on inside of you. Because it's you. It's your life. It's your experience. Don't think that this idea of God meant it good. God meant it for good. That God meant for people to be shot, for you to be hurt in some way, for you to be in some... Don't think of it that way. And that's how people will think, why would God let something like this happen? You would never say to somebody, God meant it for good, that your child is dead. Although I have had people in counseling that have had priests or ministers tell them that. There's something God's trying to tell you. So as He takes your child. It's hard to believe. So then what you have to do is forgive the priest. You have a new problem. Not only the problem that you went to see him for, but the problem that he just gave you. So when things like this happen and we're thinking in terms of God meant it for good, don't translate that into God wants me to suffer. This God meant it for good is it's a moving, organic thought. It's a stream that I want to get into. That it's not that God did this thing or caused this thing to happen to me for some lesson for me to learn, but this thing is here and it's going to help open my eyes to something greater. But it's a real trick to try to sort that out. Why would God let something like this happen? People are asking this all the time. Why would God allow hurricanes? You know, that was in the news the other day. Some minister was asking that. If God loves us, why would God allow hurricanes? That's a no-win argument, question. There's no answer to it. Love has nothing to do with whether hurricanes come or go. Hurricanes will exist always, and the trick is stay out of the way when you can. I think is it Jupiter? It's got the big red spot. It's like the mother of all hurricanes. It's been going on for a long time. There's nobody even up there to punish. So that has nothing to do with it. It's just a natural thing. And this earth needs hurricanes. It needs tornadoes, as horrible as they are. It needs volcanoes, needs earthquakes. Because these things don't happen on dead planets. Except on Jupiter. Nobody knows why that's going on, but it's been going on forever. But never, I guess, blame God for, why did you do this to me? You know, Joseph really didn't say that, ask that question of God. God, why are you punishing me for this thing? Why are you causing this to happen? Why did you allow my brothers to sell me into slavery? He just took every situation and he made the best of it. He kept a pretty positive attitude through the whole thing. And he went through it and he came out the other end a winner. So holding to the possibility that greater good is unfolding is the key to forgiveness. Name the thing for what it is, best that you understand it, but also focus on the larger, greater good is unfolding as the result of this. And I find myself fluctuate with this. Sometimes I can do it, it's really easy, because I've done it so many times. I have seen hard things work out into good situations. But when something's happening right now, you know, that's always the worst one. It's the worst of all. The trick is to remember that it's not the worst of all, that this process is happening, this unfolding of greater good is happening now. The time will come when you, like Joseph, look back and see that if his brothers had not sold him into slavery, he never would have become the second most powerful man in Egypt. And just translate that into whatever situation might be going on in your life right now. I have my situation, and everybody has one. Some are a lot more severe than mine, I guarantee that. So when you're fixated on the negative actions of another, think of Joseph and his ordeal. Despite those who would do you harm, or do him harm, he came out on top, and so will you. And I totally believe that. And that's what is great about a supporting community. That when I'm by myself, sometimes I get pretty dark. But I can talk to a friend and say, I'm not feeling so well today, and they can say, well, think about this, or how about that? And suddenly I'm okay. And we come to church and we have this experience. Maybe we came feeling one way and we leave hopefully feeling much better. But we're all in this very weird human experience with all these weird people. And some of them are pretty hard to forgive. So call them weird. You're weird. You got a problem. You did this to hurt me, but I'll be okay. That's kind of the bottom line. It's freedom. And see if that works for you. It worked for Joseph, and it often works for me, so try it yourself and see if it works for you. All right? And again, if you have any ideas, I think we got over the hard one here today, so let me know what you want me to talk about. Thanks for coming out.